Hello and a Happy New Year. So today's episode is number 48 of the Drawing the Ideal Self podcast, and we're going to be looking at the PCP version of formulation, which Kelly actually called diagnosis, and you have to remember he was writing at a different time, so in the 1950s, but Kelly's version of diagnosis is rather different and much more respectful of individuals, I think. Okay, let's get going. So the key to all of this is that experiences themselves are neutral in PCP. So what Kelly said is it's the way we interpret and give meaning to them, rather than the event themselves or the societal construction of those experiences. So any individual will construe them in their own individual way. Two people experience the same thing are not actually having the same experience. They're having their own version of that experience. And every person will be making sense of their experiences through their construing. So the way they construe an experience will be unique and apply only to them. Sometimes we're able to have shared constructions of experiences, but if any of you have ever been in a session, say at work, where you're trying to hit on the right words for the vision and work out what the vision should be for the service, it shows how difficult it is because people's construing is not the same, and sometimes we have to come to an agreement that it's close enough to be okay. But in terms of therapy and intervention, we're working with an individual and we're working with the way they see things. PCP is all about anticipating. It's anticipating what an experience will be and what sense we're likely to make of it. That's what we do all the time, every day, every moment. And we're not necessarily aware that we're doing it. We might be fully aware and recognise it very clearly, and we do that more in a very new experience. Or it might be an experience that we're not really paying that much attention to, and we're not thinking about how we construe things. And the example I often give with this is whether or not you're comfortable in your seat. You know that, but you don't really pay attention to it. So you've definitely construed the chair, you've definitely construed how your body fits into it, and you've definitely construed whether or not you can get in or out of it comfortably, and whether it's okay to stay there. But you're probably not aware of that construing, and particularly not at a verbal level. It'd be non-verbal construing or sometimes pre-verbal construing, and we've had episodes on that before. So the other thing that's really important with this is that the way we construe our experiences and our behaviour are completely interlinked. So a person's behaviour can be understood in relation to their construing, and a person's experiences informs their construing. So it's a circular process, and there's no way that those two things can be separated. It's not a neat chopping into construing and behaviour. They're one continuous experience. And for every moment we are experiencing, our behaviour is adjusting in the light of the way we're experiencing. Something that Kelly provided, which is really useful, is a kind of summary, which at the time must have been absolutely radical because it focused on the future rather than on the past. And he provided a summary of what's going on with that client, and basically that's what we would now call formulation. So these are called Kelly's 6 questions, and they're the questions that we would ask in supervision when we're encouraging somebody to think about their client and think what they're going to do with them and what their problem is and how that's going to work out. First of all, in PCP therapy of any kind, we would be focused on Kelly's 7 questions. Those are the questions which help us to understand what is going on with that client. So Kelly said the formulation of the questions is designed to get the client to 1. Place the problems, if possible, on a timeline. 2. To see them as fluid and transient, and then to interpret them as responsive to A. treatment, B. the passing of time, and C. varying conditions. Now, nowadays, we would have that probably in most kinds of therapies, and we'd be thinking that a problem isn't necessarily fixed. At the time that Kelly was suggesting this, it would have been very different from what was going on before. So the questions he would ask the client in relation to those are, upon what problems do you wish help? When were these problems first noticed? Under what conditions did these problems first appear? What corrective measures have been attempted? What changes have come with treatment or the passing of time? Under what conditions are the problems most noticeable? And under what conditions are the problems least noticeable? These seem to be pretty simple, straightforward questions nowadays, but they were different from what had gone before him. And if you think about the answers to those questions, it's going to lead to a huge amount of discussion. And that discussion will be on all kinds of aspects of these questions. So Kelly would start with those 7 questions, and then once that therapist had been working with the person, he'd be saying, okay, so let's have a think about what you're making of your client. And he has 6 questions for that. He's pretty big on lists, Kelly, which, is quite helpful nowadays because we all use bullet points. So Kelly called this a transitive diagnosis. And obviously we use diagnosis, if you think of something like DSM, in a particular way that relates to a sort of matching of the person and the description and whether they fit together. And one of the things that can be quite hard for people in terms of a PCP diagnosis is it's nothing like that. So here's what Kelly said about transitive diagnosis in a nutshell. The psychology of personal constructs proceeds from the assumption that the clinical psychologist, sorry to everyone of other professions, wants to help his clients. It therefore sets up an approach which is designed not only to embrace the realities of the client's life, but also to point out those avenues along which the client and the psychologist may proceed towards a solution of the client's problems. An important feature of such an approach is that clinical diagnosis should be construed as the planning stage for client reconstruction. So it may be kept clearly in mind just how we approach diagnosis. We are using the term transitive diagnosis. The term suggests that we are concerned with the transitions in the client's life. We are looking for bridges between the client's present and his future. Moreover, we expect to take an active part in helping the client select or build the bridges to be used in helping him cross them safely. If the psychologist expects to help him, he must get up off his chair and start moving along with him. Transitive diagnosis is, therefore, based on a dimensional system of axes and transitional states. In transitive diagnosis, the clinician, instead of preoccupying himself with the question, in what category should this case be classified, immediately addresses himself to the question, what is to become of this client? He attempts to formulate the decisive issues at the outset and forthwith directs his diagnostic examination towards resolving them. Thus, transitive diagnosis is not an end in itself, but rather the development of a plan for the client's management. The plan involves more than what some clinicians construe as therapy or even treatment. It includes everything which is done for the client's welfare. He goes on to say, a good diagnostic system is a set of coordinate axes with respect to which it is possible to plot behaviour. It makes a great deal of difference, however, whether the axes are designed to catch our fellow men like a fly in a spider's web, or are conceived as a system of streets and highways along which he can be encouraged to move in an orderly fashion. We must make sure we do not make the same mistakes thinking about the disturbed person that he has made in his thinking about himself. The coordinate axes we set up should represent many different lines of movement which are open to him, and not a labyrinth of one-way passages from which he can never escape. So Kelly does have some categories that we can use to help us think, but they're actually descriptions of the what's going on in the construing system and where people are stuck. They're not a trap for people to never escape from. And I think that's really important. So he was interested in the fluidity of experience and the fact that life happens to people and it is not going to stay the same forever. And if life doesn't stay the same, then construing won't stay the same. So we're going to look at what he called the professional constructs, which are the constructs that a professional would use to think about what's going on with that client. And what he says about that is these professional constructs do not refer to disease entities, or to types of people, or to traits. They are proposed as universal axes with respect to which it is possible to plot any person's behaviour at any time or at any place. They are also axes with respect to which it is possible to plot the changes that occur in a person's psychological processes. In themselves, they are neither good or bad, healthy nor unhealthy, adaptive nor maladaptive. They are like the points of a compass. They are simply assumed in order to enable one to plot relative positions and chart courses of movement. So Kelly's version of diagnosis is all about the movement of people from not being okay to being okay, and what might help them to do that, and what it is about their construing system and the way it's organised at the moment which is holding them back from where they want to go. So it's their own view of holding back, not our view that their life isn't going the way they want to. Kelly talks about adjustment, and he says adjustment can only be achieved in relation to something. It makes a difference what one has to adjust to. Diagnosis is not complete until the clinician has some understanding of the milieu in which adjustment is sought. This position represents a departure from the common notion that a diagnosis involves an analysis of the client only. Therefore, both the client and his milieu must be understood. And again, at the time, that would have been pretty radical, because Kelly was saying, it's no good just looking at that person. There are people around that person who could help or hinder their movement. And they might have developed a construing system which has helped them to survive in a terrible place. If you think of something like child abuse, many people will develop construing systems which don't apply brilliantly when they're an adult and they are not as vulnerable, but those construing systems will still be there, and sometimes they will interfere with relationships, and people have to learn how to construe again and not to be so fearful or have such negative expectations of people. So Kelly wants those of us who are working therapeutically with people, or working with people who wish to change, may not because they've got a major problem, it could be a coaching situation. He wants us to think about 6 questions. And the phrasing of these is interesting because he uses the word peculiar in a way that was the typical use of peculiar but isn't anymore. So it means pertaining to that individual. So his first question that he would be asking if you went for supervision with him is exactly what is peculiar about this client. When does he show it, and where does it get him? And then the second one would be, what does the client think about all this, and what does he think he is trying to do? And then thirdly, what is the psychological view of the client's personal constructs? Number 4 is, in addition to the client himself, what is there to work with in this case? And that's the reference to the fact that people live within a community of some kind or another, whether that's a family or a wider community as well. And then number 5 is, where does the client go next? And 6 is, how is the client going to get well? So that last one you could rephrase, how is the client going to get moving, or get a new job, or whatever it is that they've come to you for. So Kelly's version of a diagnosis refers to the need to think about what's going on in their construing system. So there are some things that are pretty common in terms of construing. So the first thing might be that individual constructs may not be sufficient in range or breadth so that a person can anticipate a new experience. So if you think of something like a child going to a new school, they need to be able to construe the school before they go. If they can't do that, they're going to be a bit stuck. I mean, that's a reason that we have those days where children move up to the next class or to the next school so that they can get used to the idea and get to know it a bit. The other thing that might happen is their constructs might be too loose or too tight. They might be permeable or impermeable. We've had episodes where we've thought about the tight and loose and also permeable and impermeable. And that really means that individual constructs might not be very useful for helping that person to anticipate what's going to be happening. And when we get to a point where we're not able to anticipate, we will be responding in some kind of a way. And the first way, the least response, if you like, would be anxiously. We would experience anxiety. If it gets too bad, we'll be right at the level of threat. And it's worth listening to the episodes on that, because threat's a really useful idea, because it's about the threat to the construing system. It's not whether you're going to get killed or not. It's what is being affected in your construing system. And if it's a lot of your core constructs, they're going to have a real big knock-on effect on the other constructs. And life will become very difficult for a time. So a person, in terms of their construing system, might have got some new constructs, but they haven't got connections with other things. And they're a bit sort of on their own, or they've got some very loose connections which haven't been explored and clarified. And we'll come back to that as we go through some examples. Somebody might be moving between extremes on a construct, an individual construct or a constellation of constructs, and that can cause a lot of trouble. So often change is temporary, and we see that at this time of year. People will join a gym, go for a couple of months and never go again. I've done that a number of times in my life. It's the kind of thing that often people do. Or they'll decide they're going to always eat healthily, or they're going to always go to bed early, and then what happens is over time they move back to the position they were in. So that movement is slot rattling, and we've definitely got an episode on slot rattling that you could listen to. It'd be very useful to do that if this sounds like it's something you don't know about. The other thing that can happen in a construing system is bits can be fragmented, so they're quite self-contained, and it's almost as if the other parts of the construing aren't properly recognising them and connecting up to them. So if you think of that as an analogy of something like neurons in the brain, the neurons are all connected together. Maybe there's a little patch of brain that seems to be very limited in its connections and functions on its own. And we've got some examples of that to look at today. So the PCP idea of diagnosis is really referring to the impact on the construing system. And Kelly was very helpful in that he didn't limit his thinking to only unwelcome experiences. He also had a way to think about the things that we embrace and really want to develop construing for, and that would be aggressiveness. And aggressiveness in Kellyan terms has got a particular definition. So it's the awareness that an experience will enhance and develop their construing system. So it could be through additional constructs being developed. It could be that the constructs are going to kind of be reorganised. And the degree of aggressiveness would relate to the extent of the impact on the construing system. So if it's a life-changing experience potentially, then it could have an enormous impact. In the UK at the moment, I've seen adverts for a TV programme where people who have very negative views about refugees and people coming into this country are, I think there's about 6 or 8 people, are going together to have a number of experiences which are going to teach them about the people who've tried to come here into England and the UK, the people who've tried to get into other people's countries. And I would anticipate their construing systems, I hope, will change significantly because of it. They may not. They may fragment, so that although these people are now able to understand the terrible experiences which lead to people trying to run away or pay money to get in a boat which might collapse and they'll drown, people don't do that lightly. it might help them to understand that, but they might still keep that separate from the rest of their construing and think about that only in relation to people who get in boats. So we'll have to see. I'm going to watch that programme. I think it's going to be pretty interesting. So let's think of some examples of aggressiveness. So it could be a person taking a roller coaster ride. Now that's probably going to be somebody who have been on some. They expect it to be a great thrill. They're excited, and they expect that roller coaster emotional experience will happen, and they might construe that as absolute fun. So they're embracing the roller coaster. That wouldn't be my experience, because although I like the idea of it, I really don't enjoy it when I'm on there. It's too scary. If you think of something like a person taking up a craft, at this time of year often people sign up for a new experience. They might go to Indian cookery, and they are enjoying it. They expect that they will learn new additional skills. Their construing system will be enhanced by their experiences in their evening class, say. You could think about a person choosing to read a book by a new author. So they've got the recommendation from their newspaper reviewer, and when they've taken on their books before, they've worked out well, so they're quite happy to do that. They're not expecting any problems because of it. They're embracing that experience. All the transitional constructs involve an awareness, so that the person is aware of the impact that they're anticipating on their construing system. And that's what makes them feel uncomfortable or excited. They sort of know what they're going to get out of it, but it might work out completely different from what they expected. So with anxiety, they are aware. With anxiety, their current awareness is that the way they're construing at the moment is probably not going to be sufficient to enable them to anticipate the experience. And it involves a recognition that the person is experiencing something and doesn't have all the constructs that they need so that they can do it. And they don't know what's going to happen and how it's going to play out. Anxiety involves the anticipation of invalidation of a limited range of constructs. So it's not too big an impact. And remember, we're talking about Kellyan anxiety, not the way that we use the term anxiety in current diagnostic manuals, etc. So let's think of some examples. So somebody could be going on a date with a new person. They've already chatted to them online, and they anticipate that the date will probably go well and hopefully lead to something more, but they're not sure what they're going to look like, say. And I know there are lots of TV programmes about dates which are all about that, I watched a clip on something yesterday where a guy was I think he was married in Australia, so he was getting married. He wasn't really getting married, but for the sake of the programme, getting married to someone he didn't know. And he was sweating and terrified, and you could see it, and he could barely speak when he met this girl. So, it was clear he was experiencing anxiety, that he hadn't got the constructs that would help him to deal with that situation. Another example would be a person starting a new job, but in a profession they know. And they know the people that they're going to be working with. So they know the role, and what they've got to do is learn particular ways of doing something that relate to the organisation they're joining. So it's a limited area of anxiety. They're not going to be anxious about everything because they already know who they're going to be working with, but there are ways of doing things that are related to that place. So that might make them have some anxiety. Another example would be a person who's going to eat a whole lot of different foods when they go on holiday, but they've chosen that location on purpose. They've chosen a place where they're going to enjoy the food. They wanted to go to that place, but they're not sure how their body's going to react to that, whether it's going to be okay, whether they'll get the runs or whatever. So that's anxiety. And a step up from that in terms of the amount of construing that's likely to be affected by an experience is fear. And fear is the awareness that a significant part of the person's construing system is at risk of invalidation. So this could mean the awareness that a new set of constructs are needed because there is a new core construct to be accommodated, and that core construct is going to have implications for other constructs. It could mean that the person is aware that their current construing will be affected, with core constructs having the potential to become redundant in their current form. So it might mean that you're kind of trimming some bits off the system. So some examples of these might be if a person is facing losing their long-term life partner to, say, a severe illness. They've got children together, they might be well supported, and they know that a version of a good life is going to continue, but they say they've got no idea what life is going to be like. They can't imagine a life without that person, although they're not scared of that life will turn out to be terrible overall. They have a lot of worry about what's going to be going on and may be sort of paralysed after the person dies and unable to make decisions, do things whilst they kind of recover and get used to their new way of life. Another example would be a person going to prison for a relatively short time for a driving offence that they didn't mean to commit. They're not a person who breaks the law generally, and they are facing living in a community in the prison where they anticipate being a minority and lacking the knowledge of how the relationships work. You would be very fearful, I think, if you went to prison, so that you wouldn't know how prison relationships operated, who was in charge, because it seems to me from television experience and reading some things that the people who are supposed to be in charge aren't necessarily the ones who really are. So they might be very fearful of what's going to happen, but thinking that they're going to be able to survive if they can just work it out. Another example of fear might be a shy and quiet child who started at a very busy and big secondary school. And although they've gone up with other people from their school, they're separated from them so that they might have gone into different classes. So they haven't got their usual primary school peers, and they've got to go there on the bus, and that's a very different experience. And although they liked the idea of the school when they visited, they hadn't really experienced such a demand for independence and relationship building. And they're aware of the school being too different from primary school and of feeling isolated and separated. So fear involves a lot more constructs being at risk of invalidation or parts of the system that have to develop. And then a step up from there is threat. And what we know about threat from Kelly is that it is not the threat to life, it's a threat of core constructs being invalidated. So if a lot of constructs are likely to be affected, and they're at a core level, so they're most important constructs, the potential level of invalidation might mean that that person reacts in a way, a kind of fight, flight, freeze response to their experiences. And if somebody's experiencing threat, they can lose the will to live. They may become depressed and unable to see a future. They might take extreme actions so that they can reduce their experience of invalidation, because they're having daily experience of invalidation. And for some people, they might walk out on their job or their family. They might commit a violent act to others or to themselves. They might withdraw from daily life, perhaps no longer leaving their bed or engaging with their family. So they're really stuck. So some examples of threat are if a person has a road accident and they then don't have the use of their arms and legs afterwards, it means they can't work in the profession that they worked in. They can't live independently anymore, and they might live a long way from their family and rely on caring agencies who come in to help them. Yeah, that's a massive, massive change. And we would expect a person in that situation not to be able to cope very well with being there, with having to live life in this new way. There are too many things changing at once and too many really important implications. Another example might be a young person repeatedly experiences bullying. So they go to school and find that they get bullied and bullied and bullied, so over time they don't go anymore. Then they stop going out of the house, and then they start living life at night and not in the day. And there were maybe recent efforts to understand the problems and find out what sort of education might be helpful for that young person. And then maybe since those meetings, which are trying to create a future which involves school, the young person stops eating. So you could see in a situation like that the level of threat is just too high. What's expected of that young person to go back to school and, as far as they're concerned, to experience bullying again is just too much for them. So they then can't engage with other things and they become very desperate. Another example might be a person with a learning disability who lived with their parents until they both died. And maybe they died quickly, close succession. And they might not have a home anymore because their parents rented it. And although they'll be given alternative housing and they might have carers working with them, they're frequently tearful and they've stopped going out and wanting to go to their day centre. And when a carer tries to encourage them to go so they can lift their mood, they might scream and threaten to kill the carer. That's the kind of reactions you can get with threat. Think of it as people's backs are against the wall. And when your back's against the wall and you don't seem to have any other options, you can either run away, you can fight back, or you can wait. Then Kelly has hostility. And that's really interesting because it's a completely different sort of definition of hostility. You've got to use it in the Kellyan way if you're talking about it in PCP terms. So what Kelly explained is it's the awareness, often at a lower level, that construing isn't working well because other evidence from other sources and experiences invalidates it. So it's a kind of dilemma that a person has of noticing their construing. It might be really uncomfortable to look at. And this means that the connection between parts of their construing is a bit lost from awareness, at least for some time, while they keep this false hypothesis going. However, they've got an awareness that it's not the only hypothesis. So they've got an awareness that it's false. And that's the key. You've got to remember that with Kelly's transitional constructs, there is an awareness of a problem there. Obviously, people may not tell you that they realise this at the beginning. They might come without noticing and without telling you, and it's up to the therapist to try and see what there is about their construing that they're not saying at first. So in reality, those people might work really hard to maintain their preferred construing, and they'll collect evidence that it is true. So, they'll be noticing things that go against the reality somebody else might see. So if I give you some examples of these, it might be common in a domestic violence situation that the person is believing that they are loved when actually they're being hit every day. But every little scrap of evidence that suggests love will be noticed, and the evidence that's about being hit will be minimised. Another example might be an adult has a tricky relationship with their mum, and they might describe themselves as close, but they argue a lot, and they say horrible things to each other when they argue. And they're aware that it's not a loving parent-child relationship, but they still say that they're close. So there's a sort of awareness of the discomfort of that, of the way those two things don't go together, that you don't abuse somebody verbally in an argument if you love them. Another one might be if somebody's addicted to alcohol and it's affected their health and their relationships, and they explain the difficulties without any reference to the intense drinking. Say, blaming the partner for the breakdown of the marriage, but in moments when they're aware that their drinking has led to the problems, that sort of recognition can lead them to despair and more drinking, or it could lead them to suicide, or doing other things to hurt themselves. Another example of a child might be a child who finds it really hard to keep friendships going. And they might describe themselves as having lots of friends, but the adults around them can see that they tend to bully the other kids, and kids move away from the relationship quite quickly. And now and again, that child gets upset about the lack of friends, and says nobody likes me, nobody wants to play with me, and is self-critical, but that difference in their kind of the construing they're holding on to, they might become aware of it and become miserable about it, but have no way that they can do anything to change it right now. Kelly's final one is guilt. And guilt is related to a role. So a person would experience Kellyan guilt if they feel they're not living up to that role in some way or another. So if you think of some examples of this, it might be, take a young person example, they've always been a really good student and they've done really well at school, but their performance dips when they get a new science teacher. And they become really upset about the change in their marks and ask to drop all of the sciences, so they don't want to do them anymore. And it's related to them feeling that their role as a very good student is being invalidated by that experience. Another example might be a father who can't take care of his children anymore because he had a stroke. He might become depressed about the impact on his children, and he might feel, at terrible moments that they might be better without him because of the impact on his children. So guilt can be a very, very powerful thing. Another example might be a teacher who's got a child in their class who constantly challenges them, challenges the boundaries, won't do their work, won't do their homework, and the teacher is really stressed and gets to feel that maybe their teaching days are over. And that's related to not being able to manage this particular child, but the impact on their construing is much wider than that. It might lead to them leaving the profession. So this is a very weighty episode, really, because there's lots of concepts to really get your head around. And the way Kelly used these terms are very specific, so you might need to listen to it more than once if you're trying to learn them. If you want to understand them better, you might want to get the PCP in Pictures book, because that has an illustration for every part of the theory, of the basic theory, so that it can help you to understand. And some of these quotes are in that book as well. But the idea of that book is really to give you an alternative way and to help them stick in your mind. So when I was trying to learn these terms, what I did was have them on little cards, sort of revision cards, and carry them around with me and reread them and check if I was getting them right. So flashcards. The idea of the PCP in Pictures was a bit like that, really, but it's a reference book. You don't need to actually read it. You need to maybe have access to it if you find that pictures help you. So you could give it a go. It's not very expensive. This isn't meant to be an advert, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with that. And yes, it is heavy. It's only heavy in terms of it's a lot to take in and think about. But I thought I would do it all in one episode so that it's contained together. So if you want to come back to it, you can listen to it again in one place, in one piece, if you like. And hopefully that will help you over time to understand what, if you were going for supervision, say you're going for supervision with Kelly, what he'd be asking you about, what's going on in that person's construing system. What is it that's stopping them moving on? How have they got stuck? And can you help them to adjust their construing, to develop new constructs, to extend their constructs, to use constructs from another place in their life and apply it to their life and think differently? Can you help them to get to the point where they've got over the bridge and they're off? The aim of any therapeutic encounter is to work with somebody for the least amount of time it takes for them to go happily on their way. I mean, it sounds trivial to say that, but actually that is the point, is what's the least we can do? That's not because we're lazy, it's how much do we want to be involved with somebody's life? Is it good for them to always have a therapist? For some people it is, but they're the tiny minority. For most of us, we don't need it, but we do need help from time to time. You know, it's not an unusual thing to go for an episode of some therapy or counselling, and it's okay nowadays, thank goodness. Okay, so I will see you again next month. Thanks for listening. Bye.